In looking back over my life as a preacher, I've run into, of course, many things that are uh, things that were uncomfortable, and yet by far it's been very comfortable. And the Lord's seen me through a lot of stuff, and I'm very appreciative of that. I often tell people that there are three J's in my life that have really guided my life over a long period of time. The first one is when Jesus came into my life. I was a preteen and was baptized when I was between 9 and 10 years of age, and that has meant so much to me. And then the second J is joy, and that's my first wife, who was a wonderful person. And then now it's Jewel, which is opal. And so those three J's have really dominated my life and have been wonderful. And it's made me a better person in many ways, and I appreciate that from the Lord. Okay, a lot of you, of course, will know a little bit about LST. Let's start talking, what LST stands for. This came about particularly in the lives of our daughter Sherry Lee and her husband Mark. Mark and Sherry Lee married when Sherry Lee was 19, and he was 4 years older than she. But anyhow, Mark had always wanted to do mission work overseas. So Sherry Lee was also of that attitude that she'd like to do that. So they were married and went to Germany and lived over there for about 7.5 years. And what they did was the usual thing that was often done back then. They'd do street singing, they'd try to knock on doors. You can't do that much in Europe because of the structure of their buildings and apartments and so on. But anyhow, they'd leave flyers on doors and things like that, and it just didn't work too well. And so they came back after 7.5 years, and well, actually they started this a little bit before they came back, but they decided we've got to do something different. So they came up with the idea, and others had already come up with the idea, that if you'll find somebody overseas who knows English like you get in school, say your high school years, maybe would learn English in Germany, say, and but they really didn't get the English language like we do, because we understand all the idioms and things like that. And so they decided to go over and where church was already established, and they would take this idea with them of finding people who knew enough English to converse with you, enough to really communicate, and yet not know all the idioms and so on. So they said, why don't we find these people somehow, let the church find these people, and just advertise it. If you'd like to practice your English, not learn English, but practice your English, that this would be good.
With an American.
With an American, that would be good. So they did it, and that's worked real well. They'd go ahead of time and find these people, and then when the teams over here, who were usually college students at that point, would go and spend 6 weeks in the city and have classes every day, and they could study as many times a week as they wanted to, and use the Gospel of Luke as the text. So this worked real well. And so that's the way the program worked. And then they also would have parties while they were there to let people know you can have a good time and be a Christian. And then also at the end of it, they would have a going away party and let the people know, to get to know the members of the church there, so they could continue studying their English if they wanted to. So that was the program that was done. And usually they got college students and in the universities and would take them, and they would raise their own money to go and so do that type of mission work. Well, this worked real well. And then as time goes on, went on, some of the graduate students from one place would go to another university and to study for postgraduate, and they said they would like to go back and do the same thing. And so Mark and Shirley came up with the idea, okay, we'll come up with a course of study to prepare them, but they would find students where they had now gone to school. And so it spread that way. That's the way it spread. And now they even take adults. And it's changed a lot, basically, but the principle's the same. So that's the way that's done. And then later on, they began doing what they called friends camps. They would have a camp on the weekend and let the students come and camp, and then bring their friends, and they would have classes for 2 or 3 days. And that also would enable them to bring church members there, and so there would be a connection so that when the team left, they could continue their work. So that's basically what that was, and it worked well. They took over 500 people this last year, and going into various nations, and so that's the way that works. And then when I retired from the ministry in 1992, then I began working with them and raising teams or forming teams and taking them, and that's where I went to several nations. And then when my first wife had cancer, then I had dropped out for a year. And then after I married Opal, we just kind of took up where we left off. And so that's the way we wound up going to several nations over a period of time. It was on one of those that you can gather from listening to Opal that she's pretty hard to outwit, I guess is the word. But I've done that several times, but my favorite is a time we went to Athens.
I want to tell it.
Huh?
I got to tell it.
I'm going to let you tell it.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And anyhow, we went to Romania and stayed there for 2 or 3 weeks, and then I'll let her take up from there.
Okay, this was the first place we went after we were married. We were married in May, and this was in the early fall, probably, when we went to Romania. Each of us had been to New Zealand earlier. I had been, not together, but we had that experience together, sort of. Same country, anyway. That was about the extent of my overseas travel, but he had been, altogether, he's been in over 30 countries in doing the Let's Start Talking thing. So we went to Romania as a couple to work for about 3 weeks. And it was a very interesting time for us. It was a good time for me to see that indeed vodka was about what they had in the stores, and the people were, bread was the food of choice because it was cheap, very little to eat. But anyway, when it got time for us to leave there after we'd finished our work, Max said, you never have been to Athens, have you? And I said, well, I was born in Athens, Alabama, but that didn't count. I thought that was pretty wonderful to have been there. But he said, you've been to Athens? And I said, no. And he said, well, would you like to go? And I said, well, sure, of course. He said, well, we're closer right now than we'd probably ever be again in our lives. And he said, now, you have to understand this is a second marriage. And Max has a tendency to forget sometimes which wife he is talking to, which I find very amusing and not the least bit disturbing. I understand perfectly. He lived with the love of his life for 50 years. Why would he not call me Joy sometimes? I feel blessed that he can think of me in the same breath with her. But anyway, when he said he didn't want to say her name too much, you know, we were, after all, kind of on a wedding trip of sorts, delayed. So he treated very lightly. But he said, oh, we were there in, I think it was 74. He always said 74 if he wasn't sure. So, okay. So he said, yeah, we went in 74, and he said, I'd just like for you to see it. He said, it's just wonderful. And I said, well, all right. He said, well, we have some extra miles we can use, and so I'll see if I can make arrangements. So he made arrangements for us to go to Athens. We flew into Athens and to the airport, and he got a cab, and he handed the driver a sheet of a little piece of paper with the name of the hotel and the address where we would be staying. And he turns to me and he says, now this may be the same hotel where we stayed in 74. And I thought, oh really? We're on our wedding trip, and he's taking me to the same hotel where he stayed with his first wife in 1974. And I thought it was hilarious, but I thought I would let him sweat a little, you know. So I said, oh, really? And he said, yeah. He said, and he said, well, now he said, it may not be the same hotel. He said, I'm not really sure. And I said, well, that's all right. That's fine, you know. So we pulled up in front of the hotel. The driver pulls up, and Max is looking and saying, yes, I think this might be it. And I thought, oh, boy. So I said, okay. So we get out of the cab, and we take our bags up to our room. And by that time, it's dark. We come back downstairs, and we look for the room that says breakfast in the morning. We wanted to kind of get our bearings where we were. So we found this stair that went up, and it said breakfast served in the morning here, you know. So we went upstairs, and when we got up there was nobody up there, but there was like a big French door that opened out onto a rooftop. So we walked out there, and there in all its splendor and glory lay the city of Athens. It was just gorgeous. So I thought, oh, this is so romantic. This standing here in Athens, you know, with the love of my life, there's this beautiful, beautiful panorama of lights. And while I'm standing there in my otherworldliness, my husband says to me, yeah, I'm sure this is it now. I see the Parthenon right over there. Yes, sir, this is it. So this is where we stayed. And yeah. So I turned to him and I said, oh, I said, do you bring all of your wives here? And he said, well, so far. We've been asked often how many grandchildren we have. And of course, when Max and I were first married, we didn't have quite so many, but we did have several. The first Christmas we were married, we were able to buy gifts for all family members, which we have long since ceased to do. You'll understand that better as we go along here. But the first Christmas we had bought gifts, and I was the one with the clipboard and the gifts, and Max was working on the island in the kitchen wrapping and labeling gifts. And after we'd been working for some time, Max said, you know, there's something that's bothering me. And I said, well, what? And he said, I haven't seen a gift yet for Jennifer. And I said, honey, we don't have a Jennifer. But he was worried. We had so many, he thought, that surely there had to be a Jennifer in there somewhere. But we now have 31 grandchildren. 32, oh, do you know something I don't know? No. No, he's right, 32 grandchildren. And we have 51 great-grandchildren. And we know of one that's on the way. And it just could not be more wonderful. Couldn't be better. They live in, they've lived in Uganda, they've lived in New Jersey and other foreign countries. And we have a granddaughter in California, two granddaughters in California. They're everywhere. And no, we don't get to see them. We seldom see our grandchildren and great grandchildren. But we love everyone dearly. Every one of them is precious to us, and it's a grand thing. I can't imagine. My mother would just, I don't know what she'd do if she knew that her daughter, her baby, her one little chicken actually has this huge family, just an enormous number of people, and they're all interesting, very interesting and loving and good.
You know, another thing I think that's interesting and it's a blessing is the fact that with so many people, and I think now if you count all the in-laws and everything else, there's over 125 in the family. And that, as far as I know, there's no tension at all between anybody about anything. And that's been one of the greatest blessings, because that can, and talking with people over the years, families that, you know, marry, so to speak, there's a lot of trouble and this, that, and the other. But as far as I know, there's none of that in our families, and it's everybody just accepts everybody else as they are, and we go on.
One of the blessings Max and I have had is that we don't have any money. It is. I'm very serious about that. Neither of us. When he asked me to marry him, I thought, oh, there might be money problems because, you know, maybe our kids or something. I don't know what I thought, but didn't know anything about second marriages actually. But he asked me if I would marry him, and I said yes, of course, and then thought of things. And I said, Max, do you have any money? And he said, no. You? And I said, nope. And I said, great, we got it made. We can do this.
Well, see, on my part, there was a little bit of apprehension, because when I drove up to the dorm where she was dorm mother, there was this nice big yellow Mercedes. And I thought, now, what about this? I wonder if that's hers.
He thought that he probably had hit the jackpot. However, upon closer inspection, he found that it was a 1983 diesel Mercedes, which I was indeed driving. And because I bought it because my son-in-law, who was my advisor about buying a second used car, the first one had been wrecked by my 5-year-old granddaughter, but that's another story. But anyway, we went to the dealer to find a car, and my son-in-law said, do you like this one, Mom? I said, Glenn, I don't know. You just pick one and tell me. So he walked over to this old Mercedes sitting there, and he opened the car door and he slammed it, and he said, did you hear that? I said, I guess not. What was it? And he said, that's quality. This is your car. So I said, all righty then. So I drove a Mercedes then for several years, a Mercedes diesel. We are in awe sometimes of the way the world has changed since we've been in it. For good and for ill, I think. A lot of good things have come about, many, many good things, lots of technology and information that we never dreamed of. Just in the case of cars, for example, my family, as very few families when I was a child had cars of any description. That was a real luxury. And people would often, if they had a trip to make, would ask if they could borrow somebody's car to make a trip. That was a possibility. I remember, I guess the first car we owned, we used to make a trip about 30 miles to visit some of my father's people. They lived in the country, as we said, rural roads. And often when we got to the bottom of a steep hill that had to be had to be climbed in our car, it wouldn't make it up that hill, which would be absolutely nothing today to any automobile on the market. But the car just would not pull up that hill. So Daddy would let the car roll back down the hill, turn it around, and back up the hill. Now Max, in his great wisdom, is going to explain to you why that had to be.
Well, we had one of those cars too. It was a Model T, and those cars, there was no gear shifting. You had 3 pedals. One on the left was, let's see, that was to back up. The middle one was the brake, and the one on the right was the clutch. And when you started driving it, you pushed 2 pedals. You pushed the clutch and you pushed the gas. And that's the way you did. And so there was no shifting. And when it got going like it ought to, well, then you took your foot off the clutch and it'd go on. And those clutches, they had pads, kind of like brake pads today. and of course, the clutch wore more quickly than the reverse because you didn't use your reverse all that much. So that's what would happen when the clutch would wear out and you couldn't, and it would give up going forward. You just turn the car around and put on the reverse and you'd back up the hill. Do that. Oh, me.
So that's an amazing change to us. You know, we actually experienced that.
Yeah.
I didn't live in an era when people rode horses and rode in buggies, but my mother and father told that when they were married on September the 7th, 1918, that Daddy borrowed a buggy, and Mother got into the buggy with him, and they rode to the preacher's house, sat in the buggy, and the preacher came out and performed the ceremony for them. That's slightly different from the wedding industry today.
That's the truth.
My father was about to be drafted in World War I, in 1918. And he heard that he was to go in the next call, as they said, even though he was 32 years old. And so they decided that they wanted to be married before he went away. So my grandmother was making a dress for Mother to wear for her wedding, which would have been probably very similar to the one she had, but maybe at the church or maybe at her home. And the preacher might have come to them. But anyway, that dress wasn't finished, but they ran away, actually. Well, not much running. But I remember that Mother said when they got back home and announced that they had just got married, that her daddy said, "Well, chaps, looks like you've stolen the march." Now, I'm not into language and lingo enough to know what that meant, but I think that they probably were English by background, and it had some meaning. They had gotten ahead of the game some way. So that's the story I remember about their wedding. And as I said, I think weddings have changed a great deal. Everything has changed. The water heater we had in our first house was a little black stove sitting in our bathroom, which was pretty large, and had a galvanized tank in one corner, which held cold water. And if you wanted to do laundry or take a bath, you built a fire in this stove in the house and waited until it had time to heat the whole 30 gallons of water. And if you wanted water to continue, you had to keep the fire going. So you can imagine wash day with children. It took forever to get it done, but that was much better than washing outside in a laundry tub. Do you remember your mother doing that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you want to tell a little bit about that?
I mean, the wash clothes.
Yeah, wash clothes.
Yeah, we had, yeah, you've probably seen these great big, what do we call them? Cast iron
Yeah, cast iron wash pots.
wash pot. Yeah, that's what they were called. And you'd have set this pot on some brick or a rock and build a fire under it and pull the water in and heat it that way.
And where did you get the water?
Well, we got it from a well, pumped the water up, and did that. And the interesting thing is, nearly everybody had a broomstick, and the broomstick was we were talking about poking the clothes. In other words, you'd put the clothes in the pot with the hot water, and then you'd take the stick and you'd punch the clothes to get them under the water, and then you rinsed them the same way. And then when you got through with and then when you got through with the water, you'd usually take it and pour it around the shrubs or anything like that. And
you didn't waste anything.
You didn't waste anything. And in fact, for the first 17 years of my life, we had a big tub. We call them number 3 tubs. That was a number that held so many gallons, I don't remember. And that's the way we took our baths. We'd heat the water on the stove and then pour that in there and get it just right. And then you'd take your bath and rinse off, and that's the way we took our baths. So we didn't take a bath every night or anything like that. And so it was really interesting how we lived back then. And we didn't know it was any better until things came along.